Most of us were taught the same story about the American Civil War. The North had more men, more factories, and more miles of railroad, so victory was only a matter of time. Generals moved armies across maps. Lincoln gave speeches that still make people cry. And after 4 terrible years, the Union simply wore the Confederacy down. It's a clean story. A tidy story, it is also dangerously incomplete, and in some ways flat out wrong. Because the North did not begin the war rich, it began the war broke. In the summer of 1861, the United States Treasury could not cover its own payroll, and by the last week of December it could not lay its hands on enough gold to pay the soldiers it had already sent to die. The Union did not win the war because it had money. It invented modern American money because it had to win the war. Let me say that again because it matters. The dollar you carry today, the paper that runs the largest economy on earth, was not designed by the founders. It was improvised in a panic in the winter of 1861 and 1862 by men who openly admitted they suspected it was unconstitutional. Here is what that story looks like up close. I'm going to show you a Treasury Secretary who despised paper money, issued $447 million of it, put his own face on the $1 bill, and then, sitting as Chief Justice of the United States, ruled his own currency unconstitutional. I am going to show you a Philadelphia banker who built the first mass marketing machine in American finance, 2,500 salesmen deep, sold a war to farmers and widows at their kitchen tables, and whose own collapse 8 years later dragged the country into a depression. I am going to show you the week in December 1861 when the banks of New York simply stopped handing out gold. And I am going to show you one of the strangest natural experiments in economic history. 2 governments fighting the same war on the same continent at the same time. One saw prices rise roughly 80%, the other saw prices rise roughly 9,000%. So let's go back, not to Fort Sumter and not to 1861, but decades earlier, to a fact most Americans have never been told. For most of its early history, the United States had no national paper money at all. The dollar existed, but it was a coin, gold or silver, and there were never enough coins to run a growing continental economy. The paper in people's pockets was private. State-chartered banks, more than 1,500 of them by 1860, printed their own notes, and an estimated 7,000 different varieties of banknotes circulated at the same time in different designs, different denominations, and wildly different degrees of trustworthiness. Merchants kept printed guides called counterfeit detectors on their counters, updated monthly, just to tell good paper from bad. A dollar note from a solid New York bank might pass at face value, while a dollar from a backwoods bank in Michigan might fetch 90 cents, or 70, or nothing, depending on the rumor of the week. Some banks were chartered in remote spots precisely so that no one could ever show up to redeem the notes. People called them wildcat banks, because you were more likely to meet a wildcat than a teller. Picture what commerce actually felt like inside that system. A merchant in Cincinnati closes his till at the end of the day and sorts his paper into piles. Notes he trusts, notes he will pass along quickly before anyone asks questions, and notes he already knows are wallpaper. A traveler changing trains changes money too, discounting his own cash simply for crossing a state line. This was not a frontier inconvenience at the edge of the economy. This was the economy. And Americans of that generation did not consider it strange, because it was the only monetary world they had ever known. The strangeness only becomes visible from our side of the story, where a dollar is a dollar in all 50 states and no one has ever had to think about it. That world, our world, did not evolve gradually out of the old one. It was built on a deadline at gunpoint, and the construction crew was the United States Congress in its most desperate hour. Washington itself was a financial dwarf. The federal government spent about $172,000 a day on the eve of the war, funded almost entirely by tariffs on imports and sales of public land. There was no income tax. There had been no central bank since Andrew Jackson killed the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s, a fight so bitter it reorganized American politics. Twice in a generation, in 1837 and again in 1857, this patchwork system had collapsed into panic, wiping out banks and savings across the country. The Panic of 1857 was recent enough that the men who would soon have to finance the war remembered watching it happen. A single insurance and trust company failing in Ohio in August. Telegraph wires spreading the fear faster than any panic had ever traveled before, and within weeks, banks suspending payments across the country. That was the machine the Union carried into the largest war in its history. A government with no national currency, no national bank, no meaningful internal taxation, and no borrowing apparatus worthy of the name. It was, in the words more than one historian has reached for, a sovereign with an empty purse. And here's where the story gets strange. The war did not slowly strain that machine. It snapped it almost immediately. When the shooting started in April 1861, federal spending jumped from $172,000 a day to $1 million a day within 3 months. By the end of 1861, the War Department alone was burning through $1.5 million every single day. To put that in perspective, the government was now spending its entire pre-war daily budget roughly every 3 hours. The man who had to find that money was Salmon P. Chase, an Ohio lawyer and politician who had helped found the Republican Party, who believed in gold coin the way other men believed in Scripture, and who accepted the Treasury job while making almost no secret that what he actually wanted was Lincoln's chair. It is difficult to overstate how badly cast Chase was for the role history handed him. He was a hard-money man in the oldest American tradition, a lawyer who had spent his career defending fugitive slaves and denouncing loose finance in nearly the same moral register, a man of granite certainties. The story of the next 3 years is, in miniature, the story of that granite being ground down, decision, by a war that did not care what anyone believed about money. In August 1861, he arranged an enormous loan from the banks of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, roughly $150 million, to be paid to the government in gold. It was one of the largest financial operations in American history to that point, and it bought the Union a few months. But Chase, faithful to his own principles at the worst possible moment, insisted on drawing the loan out of the banks in actual gold coin, rather than letting the funds sit as credits on their books, and wagon loads of specie rolled out of bank vaults and into government spending. Economists have argued ever since about how much this drained the system, but the bankers at the time had no doubt. Their reserves were bleeding out at exactly the moment confidence needed them full. Then the winter came. Defeats in the field shook confidence. A diplomatic crisis with Britain over 2 captured Confederate envoys raised the specter of a second war against the world's greatest navy. Depositors quietly lined up to pull their gold, and in the last days of December 1861, the major banks of New York suspended specie payments, meaning they stopped redeeming their paper in gold, and the banks of the rest of the country followed within days. The federal government followed too. Strip away the technical language, and the fact underneath is astonishing. The richest nation on the continent could not pay its own soldiers. Sit with that for a moment, because the textbooks pass over it in a sentence. 9 months into the war, before Shiloh, before Antietam, before any of the battles whose names we memorize, the Union came closer to financial collapse than it ever came to military collapse. Contractors were going unpaid, soldiers' pay was months in arrears, and the men in Washington knew something the public did not fully grasp. Armies do not run on courage. They run on payrolls, boots, gunpowder, salt pork, and railway freight charges, every item of which must be paid for in something a seller will accept. When the gold stopped, the war itself was weeks from stopping. Whatever Congress did next would be done not because it was wise, but because it was Tuesday and the money ran out on Friday. Now, watch what Congress does next, because this is the moment the modern dollar is born. In January 1862, a congressman from Buffalo named Elbridge Spaulding, a banker by trade, introduced a bill to solve the problem by fiat. The government would print its own paper money, unbacked by gold, and simply declare it legal tender for all debts, public and private. Spaulding did not pretend this was sound finance. He called it a war measure, a measure of necessity and not of choice, and he warned his colleagues that without it, the government would go into open bankruptcy within weeks. The opposition was ferocious. Bankers testified against it. Congressmen called it a breach of national honor and a violation of the Constitution. Chase himself, the man who would have to sign the notes, told Congress he supported the bill with reluctance bordering on distress. The debate that followed was one of the most remarkable Congress has ever held, because both sides were essentially right. The opponents said unbacked paper would depreciate, feed speculation, and punish anyone living on wages or savings, and all of that happened. The supporters said the government would collapse without it, and that was almost certainly true as well. One congressman after another rose to say, in effect, that they were about to vote for something they believed the founders had deliberately made impossible, and that they would do it anyway because the alternative was national death. On the 25th of February 1862, Lincoln signed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing $150 million in United States notes, printed with green ink on the back. The public named them greenbacks before the first sheets were dry. Nothing like this had ever existed in America. Not paper that promised gold later, but paper that was money, because the government said so. Congress went back to the well twice more. and by the end of the war, about $447 million in greenbacks were circulating, roughly 13% of everything the Union spent. Chase, ever the politician, arranged for his own portrait to appear on the $1 note, reasoning that a face in every wallet was a face on every ballot. The market delivered its verdict in real time. In New York, a room full of brokers, known simply as the Gold Room, did nothing but trade greenbacks against gold, hour by hour, and the price they set moved with the fortunes of the Union armies, rising on victories, collapsing on defeats, until the quotation itself became a kind of daily referendum on whether the United States would continue to exist. Lincoln reportedly wished aloud that every one of the gold speculators had his head shot off. By the summer of 1864, with Grant bleeding through Virginia and no end in sight, the paper dollar had sunk to roughly 35 cents in gold. Across the war years, prices in the North rose roughly 80%. That number is worth holding on to, because we will meet its Confederate twin shortly, and the comparison is the whole story in miniature. Now, let's talk about something the conventional narrative gets badly wrong. The greenback is the famous character in this story, but it did not finance the war. It financed about an eighth of it. The real money came from two machines the greenback merely made possible, and the first one was the tax collector. On the 5th of August, 1861, Lincoln signed the Revenue Act, which included the first federal income tax in American history, 3% on incomes over $800 a year. The 1861 tax was clumsy and barely collected, so in July 1862 Congress rebuilt it, creating a progressive tax of 3% on middle incomes and 5% on incomes above $10,000, and, more important than any rate, creating a permanent bureaucracy to collect it, the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the direct ancestor of the modern IRS. Around it, Congress wrapped excise taxes on almost everything that moved: whiskey, tobacco, carriages, billiard tables, playing cards, professional licenses, and for the first time in the Republic's history, a federal officer could arrive in an American town with a ledger and a legal right to know what its citizens earned. Assessors divided the country into collection districts. Newspapers published the income lists of prominent men, and neighbors read them the way people now read gossip. A government that had been, for most citizens, a distant post office suddenly had a presence in every county and a claim on every pay packet. By the end of the war, taxation was raising about 21% of Union revenue in a country that had never taxed a single citizen's income before. The income tax itself was allowed to die in 18. The second machine was stranger, and it had a salesman's smile. 2/3 of the Union war effort, fully 66 cents of every dollar, was financed by borrowing, and the man who made that possible was a Philadelphia banker named J. Cook. In 1862, with the Treasury desperate and the traditional method of auctioning bonds to big city bankers failing, Cook persuaded Chase to try something no government had seriously attempted: sell the war directly to the people, retail. Cook took the 520 bond, a 6% bond redeemable in 5 to 20 years, and built a distribution network of 2,500 subagents reaching into nearly every county of the North, coordinated by telegraph, advertised in newspapers and handbills that told farmers and mechanics and war widows that a bond was both a patriotic duty and the best investment on earth. Cook understood something about his countrymen that the old auction room bankers did not. Ordinary people would lend to the government if someone simply asked them in their own language, at their own scale. His agents kept evening hours for workingmen paid at dusk. His newspaper columns, many of them written or planted by his own office, explained bonds in the voice of a trusted neighbor rather than a financier. He sold in denominations small enough for a schoolteacher's savings. And when a drive flagged, he spent his own commissions on more advertising, gambling that volume would redeem him. It worked beyond anything Washington imagined. More than $175 million of 520s sold by June 1863, more than $325 million by January 1864, and Cook's final drive, the 730 loan of $1,865, moved more than $800 million of bonds, at times selling millions of dollars in a single day. Patriotism now paid interest. Something subtle and enormous happened there. Millions of Northern households now owned a personal financial stake in the survival of the federal government. If the Union died, their savings died with it. No one voted on that arrangement. It was sold to them at kitchen tables by 2,500 commission salesmen. Hold on to J. Cook's name, because history was not finished with him, and the ending it wrote for him tells you exactly how fragile this new financial world was. The third machine was the quietest, and in the long run the most radical. On the 25th of February 1863, 1 year to the day after the Legal Tender Act, Lincoln signed the National Currency Act, rebuilt and strengthened in June 1864 as the National Bank Act, designed in large part by Senator John Sherman of Ohio. The idea was elegant to the point of cunning. Banks could take out federal charters, and national banks were required to hold United States government bonds, against which they could issue a new, uniform national banknote up to 90% of the value of the bonds they held. Read the mechanism twice, and you see the loop. To print money, a bank first had to lend money to the government. War finance and nation building welded into a single machine, supervised by a new federal officer called the Comptroller of the Currency. But the state banks and their 7,000 varieties of paper were still out there, so in March 1865, Congress ended the argument with a 10% tax on state banknotes. No debate about principle, just a tax rate. No private note could survive. Within a few years, the wildcat paper that had defined American commerce for half a century was effectively extinct. Think about what actually died there. Not a few banks, but an entire theory of money, the idea that currency was a private product, issued by whoever could win the public's trust, competing note against note in the open market. That theory had governed American life for 3 generations. It was not defeated in argument. It was taxed out of existence in a single clause by a Congress that had discovered, under the pressure of war, that control of the currency was too valuable a power to leave lying around. The government didn't just print money, it took a monopoly on it. Now, before we put these pieces together, you should know that historians have been fighting about this story for more than a century, and the fight itself is revealing. The first great account came in 1903, when the economist Wesley Clare Mitchell published A History of the Greenbacks, a book so dense with price data that it is still mined today. Mitchell's verdict was cold. The greenbacks were a blunder, an inflation tax that quietly confiscated workers' wages, and the war could have been financed by bonds and taxation alone. For half a century, that was orthodoxy. Then came the pushback. Critics pointed out that Mitchell was grading the men of February 1862 with the hindsight of a professor who already knew the Union survived. In that winter, with the banks suspended and the bond market frozen, the alternative to paper was not elegant finance, but an army that stopped being paid. In 1970, Bray Hammond, a former Federal Reserve official turned historian, published Sovereignty and an Empty Purse, arguing that Congress did not follow a plan at all, that it stumbled from expedient to expedient, and that the modern American state was assembled by accident under fire. More recently, historians like Heather Cox Richardson and political scientists like Richard Bensel have flipped the frame again, arguing there was nothing accidental about it, that Republican legislators used the emergency to build the national economy they had wanted all along, with the war as both reason and cover. Bensel gave the result a memorable name, the Yankee Leviathan. Each of these schools has its critics, and none of them has the whole truth. Mitchell's numbers are still respected, while his verdict is widely doubted. Hammond's accident theory struggles to explain why so many of the accidents pointed in the same direction, and the design theory, its critics note, risks reading a coherent plan back into a Congress that was often simply terrified. Watching historians fight over this is instructive in itself, because what they are really fighting about is a question that never goes away. When a government transforms itself in an emergency, do we call that necessity, or opportunism, or both at once? But notice what none of them disputes. Not one serious historian argues the old textbook line that the war's finances were a sideshow. The fight is only over whether the revolution in American money was a desperate improvisation or a quiet design. Now, let me bring all of these threads together. You had a federal government that entered the war spending $172,000 a day and was soon spending $2 million. You had a treasury that ran out of gold before the war was 9 months old. You had a banking system that quit redeeming its own paper in the last week of 1861. You had a Congress that created legal tender paper money while doubting its own constitutional power to do so. You had the first income tax in American history, and a bureau built to collect it that never went away. You had a private banker with 2,500 salesmen turning 2/3 of the war's cost into small bonds on family kitchen tables. You had a banking act that forced banks to fund the government in exchange for the right to print. And you had a single 10% tax that executed an entire species of private money. Any one of those, another series of policies, would have been a landmark in a normal decade. Compressed into 4 years, they were not a series of policies. They were a revolution, carried out under artillery fire, mostly by men who insisted the whole thing was temporary. And if you doubt that these choices were what mattered, the Confederacy ran the control experiment. The South faced the same problem, a war costing far more than any tax base could carry, and made the opposite choices. Suspicious of central power, it barely taxed. Scholars estimate only about 8% of Confederate revenue came from taxation, while roughly 60% came from the printing press. The result was arithmetic, not mystery. By early 1865, the Confederate price index had climbed from 100 to over 9,000 against roughly 180 inches the North. Same war, same continent, different money. Confederate armies were still fighting when Confederate money was already dead. But statistics are bloodless, and this story was not. Follow the Greenback into a Union camp, where a private earned $13 a month, paid in paper that bought a third less at the end of his enlistment than at the beginning. His wife, back home, watched coffee and cloth and rent climb roughly 80%, while wages crawled up perhaps half as fast, which meant the war was partly financed by an invisible pay cut levied on the poorest households in the North. Follow the Confederate dollar into Richmond in April 1863, where hundreds of women, some carrying axes and hatchets, marched through the Capitol demanding bread at government prices and stripped the shops bare until troops were called out. A war clerk in the city recorded flour, selling for sums that had been a year's wages before the war. And follow the 520 bond into a farmhouse in Ohio, where a widow's $50 now rode on the survival of a government 800 miles away. For her, the abstraction was gone. The Union's credit was her savings. That is what it means, concretely, when a state binds its citizens to itself with money. It is not a metaphor. It is a ledger, and the entries have names. There is one more human account worth settling, and it belongs to the men at the top. In the summer of 1863, resentment at the war's burdens boiled over in New York, where a draft law allowed any man with $300 to buy his way out of conscription, at a moment when $300 was most of a laborer's yearly wage, and the greenbacks he was paid in were shrinking by the month. The draft riots that followed were the deadliest civil disorder in American history to that point, and though their causes ran deeper than money, the arithmetic of who paid for the war in blood and in depreciated wages was written all over them. The new financial machine had saved the Union. It had not distributed the bill evenly, and everyone at the bottom knew it. The war ended in 1865. The money it made did not. The greenbacks were supposed to be retired. Congress tried, retreated under public pressure, and they never fully left. The income tax lapsed in 1872 and returned, this time permanently, in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was finally created to manage the national banking system the war had built. And the story saved its sharpest ironies for its two main characters. Salmon Chase, elevated to Chief Justice, ruled in 1870 in Hepburn v. Griswold that the legal tender law he had administered was unconstitutional for existing debts, only to watch the Supreme Court, refilled with two new appointees, reverse him 1 year later in Knox v. Lee. He dissented against his own currency and died with his face still printed on it. Decades later, the Treasury put him on the $10,000 bill, the largest note ever to circulate in America. Jay Cooke, the man who sold the Union's debt, bet his firm on Northern Pacific Railroad bonds, and on September 18, 1873, Jay Cooke and Company failed and helped touch off the Panic of 1873 and the long depression that followed. The financier of the Civil War was undone by the very machine he had built, a public that had learned from him to buy paper promises at scale, which brings us to the part of the story you are standing at. Every dollar in your pocket, every number in your checking account is a direct descendant of the greenback, paper that is money because the law says so, backed since 1971 by no metal at all. The federal government that spent $172,000 a day now borrows on a scale measured in trillions through bond markets that are the towering grandchildren of Cook's kitchen table campaigns, and collects income taxes through the lineal descendant of that 1,862 bureau. None of this makes today a rerun of 1,862. History does not repeat that neatly. But the pattern deserves your attention because it has held for a century and a half. The machinery of money in America expands in emergencies. It's called temporary, and then quietly becomes the floor the next generation stands on. The greenback was temporary, and it is in your wallet. The income tax was temporary, and it is in your pay stub. The federal monopoly on currency was a war expedient, and no living American has ever transacted outside it. Emergencies end, machinery endures, and each generation inherits, as simple background reality, arrangements its great-grandparents regarded as constitutional outrages. It is worth asking, calmly, which of today's temporary measures your grandchildren will mistake for the natural order of things. The next time someone tells you the Civil War was won by bigger battalions and better speeches, you'll know better. The Union was preserved by its soldiers, but it was financed into a new kind of existence by a bankrupt Treasury, a reluctant secretary, a banker with a telegraph, and a Congress that crossed a constitutional line because the alternative was collapse. The textbook version is not so much false as decaffeinated. Follow the money, and the American dollar stops looking like a fact of nature and starts looking like what it actually is. A wartime emergency that outlived its war, was contested all the way to the Supreme Court, and won. It was not inevitable. It was chosen, and it is still being chosen every day it is believed in. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the money underneath the events everyone thinks they already know, then subscribe, because this channel exists to tell exactly these stories, and there are many more coming. And tell me in the comments which of these machines you think actually saved the Union: the greenback, the bonds, the taxes, or the banking acts. I ask because the answer is genuinely contested, and I read every single one. If this earned it, a like helps more than you know. Thank you for watching.